I'll be naming 57 80s films, no particular reason. They're just a list of 57, all mixed in, all types of movies, from serious to just having fun. So we'll start with Night School, a 1981 film with Rachel Ward, which I've talked about in my other films. You can check my playlist for that. 1981 is a scary film, I guess, a slasher kind of film. It might be cheesy, but definitely check it out. Working Girl, 1988, directed by Mike Nichols, is a much more serious film with Melanie Griffith, Harrison Ford, Sigourney Weaver. And we move on to Gloria. Gloria is a 1980 film directed by John Cassavetes with Gena Rowlands, and is basically about a woman who takes it upon herself to protect a young boy from the mafia or something to that effect. And we move on. Now, my fourth film is Weekend at Bernie's. If you're looking to have a little bit of fun during the weekend, don't know what to do, like these characters, and if I'm wrong, then correct me. This is with Andrew McCarthy and Jonathan Silverman. It is directed by Ted Kotcheff. Again, that's Weekend at Bernie's, and it's a more light film, maybe with a strong message. Again, check it out. Let me know what you think. I've mentioned Weird Science. I always think that you should check that. It's really typical of a John Hughes film. It introduces Kelly LeBrock. Also is Anthony Michael Hall is in this, and that's Weird Science, 1985. You get to see how they were thinking about the future, computers, and you get a little sense of the era. We move on to 1989, The Abyss. That's director James Cameron with Elizabeth Mastrantonio and Ed Harris. It's a film, I guess, it's in the water, deep down in the water. So check it out. Again, this is director James Cameron of Titanic fame and other films, and also Terminator. We move on to Racing with the Moon. This is a film with Sean Penn, Nicolas Cage, Elizabeth McGovern. Racing with the Moon, 1984. Now we move on to Short Circuit. It's a 1986 film with Ali Sheedy and Steve Guttenberg, and it deals basically with a robot who is the main character in this, and their situation at that time. We move on to something a little bit different, more of a kind of an action film, if you like. Murphy's Law, that's 1986 with Charles Bronson and Kathleen Wheelhoyt. If I'm mispronouncing that, forgive me. And I think the Carrie Snodgrass, if I'm not mistaken, is in this. And it's sort of like a buddy cop, only it's Charles Bronson with Kathleen Wheelhoyt. They're attached to each other somehow, and they're looking to solve, in this case, I guess he's been framed. So if you're looking for that type of film, then definitely recommend Murphy's Law, 1986 with Charles Bronson. Say Anything, it's a 1889 film with John Cusack, directed by Cameron Crowe. So check that out. We move on to Cutter's Way, 1981. This features Jeff Bridges, John Hurt, and I believe it was directed by John Badham. If I am wrong, correct me. But anyway, check it out. Cutter's Way, 1981, with Jeff Bridges and John Hurt. We move on to War Games. That's a 1983 film featuring Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy. and if I'm not mistaken, it's about a kid that somehow gets access to government computers and starts some kind of war, and him having to deal with that situation. We move on to The Thing, 1982 film. That's a film directed by John Carpenter. If you're not familiar with John Carpenter, this is a good film to see. This features Kurt Russell in it, and it's called The Thing. And again, it's more of if you like into horror, those type of films, scary films. This is 1982. You get to see how directors worked on films regarding this particular subject matter, and hopefully it'll be interesting for you. That's The Thing, 1982. Now we move on to Thief of Hearts. Thief of Hearts is a 1984 film with Stephen Bauer and Barbara Williams and John Getz. Essentially, it's I guess about a woman who has a journal, and I think this character gets a hold of it, and he starts to introduce himself into her life, knowing full well what her thoughts are. So it's an interesting subject, and you should check it out. Why not? Thief of Hearts, 1984. Sorry for the background noise, but I'm doing this live. Here we go. Heathers, 1989. That's with Winona Ryder and Christian Slater. Definitely take a look at it if you want something light and fun. Heathers, 1989, with, as I mentioned, Winona Ryder, Christian Slater. If that's not something you're looking for, maybe a Brian De Palma film from 1984 it's called Body Double, with Craig Wasson and Melanie Griffith. So that's called Body Double, and it's directed by Brian De Palma. If you want something a little bit more thought-provoking, there's RoboCop, directed by Paul Verhoeven, 1987, with Peter Weller. It's an interesting topic. It has to do with half man, half machine kind of thing. So that's RoboCop, 1987. We move on to First Blood. This is probably the film that started the whole Rambo series. This is obviously with Sylvester Stallone, Richard Crenna, Brian Dennehy. It's directed by Ted Kotcheff, a 1982 film. Okay, the same director that directed Weekend at Bernie's has directed this film that I just mentioned, which is First Blood with Sylvester Stallone. And make sure you get the right one. It's the 1982. It's called First Blood. Introduces the character, his motivations, and it's not the usual what you expect of a Rambo film, but it goes a little bit more into the character and why he does what he does. So moving on to Full Metal Jacket. Now we're going deeper into the war here. 1987. This is a Stanley Kubrick film with Matthew Modine. And if you want to get an idea of what it is to go, I guess, into the military, the training, you get a full exposure, or at least a glimpse of what it's like. And I won't say anymore. So we go from Full Metal Jacket. We're going to go now to Vamp, which is a 1986 film directed by Richard Wenk. It features Grace Jones and Billy Drago. It deals with vampires. So if you're interested in finding, obscure vampire films, this is one of them. I I will probably mention a few others here. Excuse me. We move on. So, Blood Simple. This is a 1984 film directed by Joel Coen with Frances McDormand. I may be wrong, but this might be their first film. So if you haven't seen it, you should definitely check it out. And we move on. Platoon. Another war film. This is directed by Oliver Stone, 1986. It features Tom Berenger, a memorable character in this movie. It has Charlie Sheen as the lead. William Dafoe is also in it. It's another take on the war. This came out first. Platoon came out in 1986, and then Stanley Kubrick did his version of the war in his Full Metal Jacket. We move on. A little more of, I guess, fantasy, or it's called The Beastmaster. This is a 1982 film with Rip Torn and Tanya Roberts. If you like this type of film, this was in 1982, so take a look at it. It's The Beastmaster with Tanya Roberts and Rip Torn. Now, another vampire movie that maybe you have seen or maybe you haven't. It's called The Hunger. It's a 1983 film. It's directed by Tony Scott. It features Catherine Deneuve, David Bowie, and Susan Sarandon. So, if you are into vampire films and you haven't checked this one out, it's called The Hunger, 1983, directed by Tony Scott. If you want to see, I might as well just say what it is. It's Mad Max 2. This is The Road Warrior, 1981, with Mel Gibson. It's directed by George Miller, and it's Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, 1981, with Mel Gibson. I'm assuming this is the follow-up. I don't think the first one was done in the 80s, but this one certainly was in 81, so definitely take a look at it. Okay, so a little bit of James Bond. So in 1985, we have A View to Kill, 1985. This is with Roger Moore, Christopher Walken, and again, Grace Jones, and I believe also Tanya Roberts is in it, who I just mentioned in The Beastmaster. We move on to Fitzcarraldo. This is a 1982 film with Klaus Kinski as the definite must-see. As the director is Werner Herzog, and it's called Fitzcarraldo, 1982. Now we change up a bit here. We are going to 1986, a film with Gary Oldman. It's Sid and Nancy. So if you have not seen that, I believe that this is in reference to the Sex Pistols, but the relationship between Sid and Nancy. It's with Gary Oldman. Okay. Then we do Order of Death. That's a 1983 film, Order of Death, with Harvey Keitel and John Lydon, also known as Johnny Rotten of, I guess he was the frontman of the Sex Pistols. So you should definitely check that out if you are into the Sex Pistols. This is again featuring John Lydon, who's known as Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols. He's a frontman, and it's called Order of Death, 1983, with Harvey Keitel. I think Harvey Keitel here plays kind of like a crooked cop, and the character that is played by Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistol comes into his life, and Harvey Keitel keeps him prisoner. So it's an definitely interesting take on this type of film. So we move on to The Killer. If you like action films, John Woo is the director. It's a 1989 film. It's called The Killer. We move on to A Dry White Season. A Dry White Season, 1984. This has Marlon Brando in it, Donald Sutherland, and Susan Sarandon. They're dealing with apartheid in, I believe it's South Africa. It's a much more serious film. Definitely an 80s film. It's A Dry White Season. I have here 1980, maybe it's 1889. Maybe I miswrote it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is 1989. I don't think it was in 84. Then we move to 1984 again. Not again. That was the previous was 1989. But this one is 1984. It's Paris, Texas. It's directed by Wim Wenders. Interesting film. If you have not seen it, it features Harry Dean Stanton, Dean Stockwell, and Natasha Kinski. And we move on. So we move on to Johnny Handsome, a 1989 film with Mickey Rourke, Ellen Barkin, and Elizabeth McGovern. If I'm not mistaken, I think the character somehow ends up undergoing facial reconstruction, so people don't know who he is, but I may be wrong. I'm not quite sure, and I guess this happens due to either him trying to avoid I want to say the mafia, but I'm not sure if it's the mafia. But anyway, check it out. It's with Mickey Rourke, as I said, in 1989. Johnny, and the film is named Johnny Handsome. We move on to Little Nikita, a 1988 film with Sidney Poitier and River Phoenix. If you're not familiar with River Phoenix, definitely check out Little Nikita. River Phoenix, if you don't know, happens. Was the brother of Joaquin Phoenix because he passed away. So then we move on to Another Woman. This is a Woody Allen film, 1988, with Jenna Rollins again, Mia Farrow, Gene Hackman. It's much more serious. Definitely check it out. We move on to Reckless, 1984. As I said, I'm not sticking to any particular genre. I'm just like different things. Reckless is a 1984 film directed by James Foley. It features Aidan Quinn. I think this might have been his first film. Daryl Hannah, too. These are probably both their first film or close to early career films. So it's called Reckless, 1984. Check it out. We go to 1987. This is Good Morning Vietnam. It's a war film. It features Robin Williams. And if you like Robin Williams, you'll probably like this film called Good Morning Vietnam. We go to a typical also 80s film, which is The Goonies, 1985, with Josh Brolin, Corey Feldman, Sean Astin, and the director is Richard Donner. From there we go to The Howling, which I think is a scary film, 1981. It's called The Howling, directed by Joe Dante, and it features Dee Wallace, Dee Wallace. From there we move on to Mannequin, a 1987 film with Kim Cattrall and Andrew McCarthy. Essentially, Andrew McCarthy ends up falling in love with a mannequin that comes to life. We move on to Legend. This is a Ridley Scott film from 1985 with Mia Sara and Tom Cruise. And it's a fantasy kind of film, so check it out. Legend, 1985. Cocoon is a 1985 film with Ron Howard, and it has to do with I guess aliens somehow find themselves on Earth, older people somehow finding contact with them, and it's an it certainly deals with a serious topic. It's called Cocoon. So if you're looking for something maybe a little bit different, it's Cocoon. We move on to Her Alibi. This is a film from 1989 with Tom Selleck and Paulina Porizkova. So we move on to Das Boot, D-A-S and then Boot, B-O-O-T, 1981. It's sort of a war film that takes place in a submarine. It's directed by Wolfgang Petersen. And we move on to Scrooged. Scrooged is with Bill Murray. It's again a film directed by Richard Donner, 1988. And obviously it's Scrooged. It's a version of Scrooge, only I guess a bit more comedic. It has Bill Murray in it, so I would think this is what it's going to be more on it. So you should definitely take a look at it and see what you think. Then we move on to The Falcon and the Snowman. This is a film from 1985 with Sean Penn and Timothy Hutton, dealing a little bit more with, I guess, the Cold War. Now we move on to something more silly. Police Academy, 1984 with Steve Guttenberg and Kim Cattrall. So that there's many Police Academies, but I believe this is the first one. So you should take a look at the Police Academy from 1984 and let me know your thoughts. Now we move into The Mission. This is a film from 1986 with Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons. I think it takes place in somewhere in South America, and I believe it deals with two brothers. We move on to My Bodyguard. It's a more light film, high school, 1980. This is with, let me just say, Matt Dillon, Chris Makepeace, and it's directed by Tony Bill. It's called My Bodyguard, and essentially he's a kid that's been bullied at school, and he's had enough, so he hires somebody who's the tough guy to be his bodyguard, and how his life is transformed through him hiring the bodyguard. We move on to a film called The Emerald Forest from 1985. It's directed by John Borman. This film is with Powers Booth. Essentially, it's a film about, and I think it's based on a true story, about a father who's an engineer and is in the Amazons, in Brazil, in the Amazons. Then they're destroying the forest or what have you, and he happens to have his son with him on the day he was working. He's an engineer, and I guess his son gets a little too far away, and his son is kidnapped by the natives of the forest, and he is completely devastated. And the whole film is about him trying to, every year, trying to find his son, and I think it goes on for at least 10 years. So it's definitely a very interesting and very powerful story. That was The Emerald Forest in 1985 with Powers Booth. Now, we move to Mr. Mom, 1983. This is with Michael Keaton and Terry Garr. And, I guess this has to do more with Michael Keaton becoming the mom and doing all the housework and all that. So it's a comedy from what I am gathering here. And if I'm wrong, correct me. Hope you take a look at it, or at least look at some of my suggestions. We move on to Prizzi's Honors. If you like the Godfather type movies, this is one of them. This is a 1985 film with Jack Nicholson, Kathleen Turner, and it's called Prizzi's Honor. Now we move on to Stakeout. Stakeout is sort of, again, like Richard Dreyfuss and Emilio Estevez play cops that are staking out some how do you call it, criminal. And it also features Madeline Stowe, and things completely are flipped around. So it's called Stakeout, 1987, with Richard Dreyfuss, Emilio Estevez, and Madeline Stowe. Now, Sudden Impact is a 1983 film with Clint Eastwood, directed by Clint Eastwood. It's very violent, from my understanding, but this is very typical of the films of that era. I've mentioned already Charles Bronson. I didn't get into Chuck Norris, but he's another one. These were all low budget, non-Hollywood kind of films, but nonetheless they were part of the 80s. This is Clint Eastwood and Sudden Impact with Sandra Locke, and it's from 1983. And as I mentioned, it might be strong or too violent, but again, I leave that up to you. Urban Cowboy is another film from the era. This is a film that John Travolta was, at that time, I guess, trying to find a hit, if you like. This is with Deborah Winger. She was also hot in the 80s. It's called Urban Cowboy.